Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our continuing study of Revelation. We're going to be in the remainder of chapter 14 today. It involves verses 14 through 20. And we're going to see that there's two scenes. One is a scene that looks like judgment, but it doesn't really have the feel of judgment. It involves a harvest of wheat. And the second scene is obviously a picture of judgment, and it involves the harvest of grapes, which we're going to see is not really a reaping of grapes. It's called a vintaging of grapes. We'll see that as we go into it. So let me read verse 14 through 16, and we'll get into our study. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, and the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. All right. So we're talking about a harvest of the earth. Let's read 14, and then we'll start our study. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. The scene is devoted to harvesting the earth. The question is, harvesting the earth of what? What does the harvest involve? John sees a white cloud. Clouds often represent the majesty of God's presence. John also sees one seated on the clouds like a son of man. Ezekiel referred to himself as a son of man. If you've studied Ezekiel, you can't miss it. Just a few of the verses that involve that are Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, and it's just all over the book. He calls himself a son of man. Jesus used the term as a favorite term, actually, to apply to himself in Matthew 4:6, Matthew 8, verse 20, and Matthew 10, verse 23. All these verses you should go look up just for your own benefit and edification. And then there's also a chapter in Matthew 24:30. There's a reference to the Son of Man. I want to read that one. Matthew 24, verse 30. All right, listen to this. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And he's talking about himself. Then there will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the people of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. There's the clouds with power and great glory. It says the people of the earth, all the people of the earth, the entire earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming. All right. So John also sees one seated on the clouds like a son of man. It's hard to believe anybody could consider this as anyone but Jesus himself. His favorite phrase is used to describe the one on the clouds, and his return to the earth has always been associated with coming in the clouds. We saw that in Matthew 24:30. So I think it is safe to say that this one that we're talking about here in Revelation 14:14 is Jesus. He's wearing a gold crown. In Revelation 14:14, he's wearing a gold crown. This is not a diadem crown. but a Stephanos crown. And there's a couple of things that are very interesting about this. It's a Stephanos crown, which is called a victor's crown. It's a Stephanos crown was awarded to people that won athletic events. And what's interesting is Jesus is coming in victory. He's wearing a Stephanos crown. But the interesting, I mean, there are many interesting things about it, but one thing in particular is Stephanos crowns were normally made of like a wreath. They were perishable. I mean, some of them were even made of celery, a wreath of celery, and so they really decompose over a period of time. But this Stephanos crown was made of gold. And so it's not going to perish. It's not going to tarnish. This is a forever crown. It will not deteriorate. And Jesus is wearing it in the form of a Stephanos crown, a victor's crown. He's coming in victory. And he is carrying a sharp sickle. Sickles are used for harvesting wheat. Let's just talk about wheat for right now, not grapes, but just wheat. Sickles were used to harvest wheat. The sickle is swung to chop the heads off of the wheat plants. You get a stalk of wheat, and at the top you get this bushy head with wheat and seeds and all those things on top. And they come along and chop that off with the sickle. They just have a wide swinging, quick swinging motion and take the whole head off. All right, so let's look at verse 15. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Okay, this verse I had a little trouble with. It looks like the angel is telling Jesus what to do. It looks like he's giving him an order. And I first thought it was like an instruction of what Jesus is to do, not to order him to do it, but just a word picture of what he's going to be doing. Now I think now the role of this angel and what he said to Jesus is much more important than that. Let's read it again. Then another angel came out of the temple. He came out of the temple. That's very important. He came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud. And then he issues what looks like a command: "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." The angel comes out of the temple. The temple is clearly associated with the dwelling place of God. That's where God is. We know he's omnipresent. He can be everywhere, but he's thought of to be dwelling in the temple, and that is where the angel came from. He came from the temple. He was in the temple, and he came out with this instruction for Jesus. This angel calls out to the one seated on the cloud, who is Jesus. So when he comes out of the temple, what does he say? I want to read it again. I know you think I'm beating this thing to death, but I want to read it again. What does he say when he comes out of the temple? He says, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." He says, reap, the harvest of the earth. The first question is this: in order for Jesus to reap, I think, is it an order? The first question, is this an order for Jesus to reap? Does this angel look at Jesus and say, "You go do this"? Does he do that? And the first answer would say, of course not. But surely you know, because I'm making such a big deal of this, I think it's something different than, of course not. I think it is. I think it is an instruction. I hate to think of it as an order. I think it's an instruction for Jesus to do this, not because the angel or anybody else has authority over Jesus, but because Jesus himself said this. He said, no one knows the time of his coming. I want to read Mark 13, verse 32 and 33. Mark 13, verse 32 and 33. But about the day or hour, no one knows. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. Only the Father knows. So the purpose of the angel is to, as he comes from the temple where God is to tell Jesus that that time he did not know before has now come. The angel had been in there with God. God says, the time is now. Go tell Jesus and tell him to reap. Remember, he comes in judgment when he comes. He came from God with the news for Jesus. He called it out in a loud voice so the heavens and the angels and the angelic court would hear it as well. And John, let's not forget John. John heard it as well. Take your sickle and reap. A long, sharp, flat blade used for reaping wheat, as well as other things. He says everything that is to be harvested is ripe. It is ripe and the time has come. It is ready. Ripe means literally dried up, like wheat when it is ready. You know, it grows up and it's green and all those things that plants are. And when they ripen, sometimes in the case of wheat, they dry out. And that's the condition that it's in. It's ripe. So we're talking about wheat, not grapes. We're talking about two separate things here. Now we're talking about wheat. We will be talking about grapes later. And so what is he to reap? He is to reap the harvest of the earth. Here is where it gets sticky or murky. Just a little bit. Starting in verse 17, let's see. Starting in verse 17, we have another scene. So what does this mean, the harvest of the earth? It's going to be the lost. It's going to be the lost, the last believers on earth in Israel. This is not judgment. A few want to make this about the rapture. This does not sound like judgment. The last receive judgment. The lost receive judgment in the next scene, which is verse 17 to 20. I believe this is a harvest of remaining believers still on earth, and possibly Israel. We'll just have to watch for that as we go, possibly. Zechariah 12 was clear that in Zechariah 12, verse 10, about the meaning and therefore the repentance and realization that they crucified their Messiah, speaking of Israel. Let's read Zechariah 12, verse 10. If you've been in my class very long, you've heard this verse read many times. Zechariah 12, verse 10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. Israel will have hardened heart. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Zechariah 12 was clear about the meaning and therefore the repentance and realization that they crucified their Messiah. We have many, we know many have been saved in the tribulation. It said, the Bible has told us that multitudes will be saved there. But when Jesus comes, the Jews are going to be saved. And they're going to be saved in one day. This says they're going to be saved. He's going to pour out a spirit of, what do you call it? A spirit of grace and supplication. And they're going to look on him and mourn. Do you remember what we said in Matthew 24:30? The whole world is going to mourn when they see the coming of Jesus. And the reason they're going to mourn, and in particular the Jews, in this prophecy in Zechariah 12, in particular, they're going to realize that they crucified their Messiah. They're going to see his marks on his hands and the wound in his side, and they're going to realize that they crucified his Messiah, and they're going to be grieved to the point of the type of grieving when a child is lost, an only child and a firstborn child. So Israel will have hardened hearts and a partial blindness. They will have hardened hearts and a partial blindness regarding the gospel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. I want to read Romans 11. I'm just seeing like I'm all over the place here. But I want to read Romans 11, 25 and 26. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. And then he goes on and talks about the second coming of Jesus. Now, what happened was, if you recall, at the resurrection of Jesus, we were told, the Bible tells us that some lies were spread about somebody coming and stealing his body. And the religious leaders of the day and the Jews believe that, and they believe it to this day. But that lie hardened their hearts where they could not believe the account of the resurrection. Okay? And the Bible tells us in that verse there in Romans 11, that when the full number of the Gentiles comes in, when all the Gentiles are going to be saved that are going to be saved, or saved that are going to be saved, then Jesus will come, and the Jews are going to believe that way, and they're going to mourn when they realize that they crucified their Messiah. Okay, so these verses are not judgment. Saved people do not experience wrath. We're talking about wrath coming on the earth, and they do not experience wrath. This is final preparation for the final judgment, which we'll see in verses 17 to 20. These verses are a depiction of Armageddon. So let's look at verse 17 through 20. Let me read through that. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice. Notice where he's coming from. He came from the altar. He had charge of the fire from the altar. The altar's in the temple. And called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. The angel swung his sickle to the earth, gathered his grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press. This is Armageddon right here on Judgment. And blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which is 180 to 200 miles. Pretty deep blood flow. So, the vintage of the earth and the winepress of wrath. Let's read verse 17 and 18, and we'll get on with this. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, And he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came to the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, take your sickle, your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. Two angels with different jobs. The first came out of the temple with a sharp sickle. The second angel does not have a sickle. He had charge of the fire of the altar, and he comes from the altar, and he calls to the first angel. And what did he say to the first angel? He said, take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe. So Jesus does not do the reaping here as he did on the first scene. Here the first angel does the reaping, except it is not called reaping. He says it is called gather the grapes, the clusters of grapes. Didn't say reap them, but gather them, gather the clusters of grapes. This means vintage, not reaping. Wheat is reaped, grapes are vintaged. But you never heard that before. We reap grapes, we reap wheat, but we vintage grapes. So when you hear a wine, say vintage 1984, it means they were made from grapes in the 1984 harvest. They were not reaped, they were vintaged. They were plucked from the vines, not with the swinging motion of a sickle, but they were plucked. You got a vine with clusters of grapes on it. You can't just swing a sickle and chop the whole vine down. They have to pluck out the individual stems of grapes, and it's called vintaging. The scene is without a doubt separate from the first scene of verses 14 to 16. So let's read verse 19. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered of course he can't actually swing it, but this is the term used here. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathering its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. Okay, getting pretty ugly here. The grapes fall from let's see. He swings his sickle, the grapes fall from the vines. They are then thrown into the great winepress of God's wrath. No doubt, but that the grape clusters represent unsaved, sinful mankind going to judgment. Note that this, like the wheat harvest of verse 15, is worldwide. The angel swings his sickle on earth. They will experience God's wrath, and they will experience it at Armageddon. We're going to see it in verse 20. So we had the first group. The first scene deals with people saved. The second group deals with a harvest of lost people. You know, we've gone through several various judgments, trumpets and whatnot. We've had, I think, 3 different kinds. We still got to talk about the bowls, but we've had seals and trumpets. And in every case, we had groups of people, large groups of people that wanted nothing to do with God. They kept saying, you know, some of them ran into caves. God sent judgment and giant boulders were falling down, and they ran into caves for shelter, knowing that it was God that was doing it. He says, we would rather go into a cave than repent. They had no interest in repenting. And so they're going to experience God's wrath. So let me read verse 20. He had just said, he was just told to swing the sickle on the earth, gather the grapes, and throw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. And this is part of it coming up right here. Verse 20, they were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, 180 to 200 miles. It's basically the full length of Israel. So this winepress is metaphoric for God's judgment. The grapes are thrown into the winepress in judgment, and then the winepress normally will be pressing out wine, grape juice, but in this case it's pressing out blood, and it's the blood of Armageddon, and it's going to flow deep, very deep, for a long ways. All right, so no doubt this judgment, the action of the winepress, happens outside of Jerusalem, which is the city it's referred to here. The rest of the verse is difficult. The blood flows for 1,600 stadia, which is 180 to 200 miles, roughly the full length of Israel, to the horse's bridle, which is 5 feet deep. 5 feet deep, 180 to 200 miles flowing. Not like a lake, more like a river. It's flowing. That's an inconceivable statement. Not even envisioned, cannot even be envisioned in your mind's eye, even for what we know to be a happening at Armageddon. It's very difficult to accept as literal, but the judgment of the lost will drink of the wine of God's fury, poured out full strength, is said in verse 10. His judgment will be poured full strength, and it will be experienced in complete destruction. Wherever the last one is to be found, they will be judged and destroyed. Israel is saved right here and right now in Zechariah 12, verses 9 and 10. I want to read it again. Zechariah 12, verses 9 and 10. I'm backing up a verse from what I read before. On that day, I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem. Remember where Armageddon is going to occur? Right at Jerusalem. I will set out to destroy all the nations that attack Jerusalem, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. Remember this verse of prophecy. They will mourn, they will look on me, the one they have pierced, the one they crucified, as one mourns for an only child and grieves bitterly for him, as one grieves for a firstborn son. They're going to look on Jesus, and they're going to realize, they're going to mourn when they realize that they crucified their Messiah. Horrible thing will be happening in Jerusalem. Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 3 tells you. Zechariah, it's a prophecy again. Zechariah 14, 1 through 3. No, I don't need to read that. But then the day of the Lord is described in Zechariah 14, 3 and 4 as at the second coming. Let's read that. Zechariah 14, verses 3 and 4. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, the day of the Lord, the second coming, on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley with half of the mountain moving north and half moving to the south. It's going to be quite a happening when Jesus comes again. The rest of the day is described in the following verses of Zechariah 14. And that's all in prophecy. At the time Zechariah wrote it, it hadn't happened yet. And to this day, it's still in our future as well. All right, so that's the harvest of the earth and the trampling of the winepress in the winepress. And that completes our study of chapter 14. Thank you for studying with me.